We now return to the Real Ghostbusters.
Hello everyone, I am Zazubaar, and my god, it has been a long time since it's just been me, you, the camera, and the existential dark void of silence. But here we are, back again, doing a solo video. And as per usual, it's going to be about a comic book. So, lately, I have been on a huge Ghostbusters kick. And believe it or not, it actually was off of the new all-female Ghostbusters remake that came out a few weeks back. Despite, if you saw my review, you know that I was not what you would refer to as a fan of that film. But, not that I hated it, because I don't want to start any comment flame war. But I've been on a huge Ghostbusters kick because that movie got me back interested into the franchise and made me want to revisit the first two original Ghostbusters films, which I've seen a couple of times now back to back this past summer. And those will come up throughout the video, primarily the second one at the end of this video. And I also revisited the Real Ghostbusters cartoon, the animated series that spun out of the 1984, I think that's when the first one came out, live-action movie. That's just sort of an animated, rough adaptation of the concept of Ghostbusters. Then I learned of a crossover that IDW has done, because they also do Ghostbusters comics. They have been for years, and apparently they're great, and I haven't read any of them until now. And they did a crossover with the Ghostbusters, which they did a few of. They did one with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which I'd also love to get my hands on. Though that's with the IDW Ninja Turtles, so I feel like I should probably read that before I jump into their crossover with the Ghostbusters, but just concept-wise, that sounds awesome. And they also did, they may have done more, but this is the other one I'm familiar with. They also did a crossover between their version of the Ghostbusters, which is essentially like the main official canon movie version of the Ghostbusters, because the IDW Ghostbusters comics, which I've now read the first volume of, I may do a video on that at some point, but that's a whole other animal, is a direct follow-up to the Ghostbusters video game from 2009, which is the closest thing to a Ghostbusters 3 we will ever get, and they are both in what Columbia and Sony, I guess, consider the official original Ghostbusters timeline, which includes Ghostbusters 1 and 2, that game, and now the current IDW comics. So, essentially, what their other crossover is a crossover between closest thing to the movie version of the Ghostbusters as we have right now, and the animated real version of the Ghostbusters in what is perfectly called Get Real Ghostbusters, which I was disappointed to learn was not the Ghostbusters actually getting real, where we finally learn about Venkman's horrible Xanax addiction and, the fact that Ray just dips into whatever the fuck anybody's got in the medicine cabinet. He doesn't fucking care, just whatever gets him there. Egon, of course, he has a need for speed. I mean, he's got to build all that crazy technology. God knows how he gets the money for it, but we don't know how he gets the money for his speed either, so it's all a mystery. And then poor Winston, man. Winston likes to have a beer every now and then, but this is not what Get Real Ghostbusters is about. It is, as I said before, a crossover between the IDW version of the Ghostbusters and the real version of the Ghostbusters, the animated version. And it is pretty fun. So I'm going to be doing a review of that today, in case that wasn't clear already. So I picked this up a few days back. I read it in like 2 sittings, just took like 1 break. It's 4 issues, I think. It makes sense. Most of these things are 4-issue miniseries. What's interesting about it is that it really does a good job of making the distinctions between the real Ghostbusters animated series versions of these characters and the, let's call it, prime timeline of the classic Ghostbusters from the movie and from the IDW comics. Because they are definitely very different. If you've ever seen the Real Ghostbusters show itself, or you've ever just seen like a review of it, or even just random pictures of it online, I'm sure you've seen that the character designs themselves of the Ghostbusters are very different from the movie versions, and they did that because they didn't have the rights to use the likenesses of the actors. And that's sort of enough for the comic book medium, I think. But what's really impressive and great about Get Real Ghostbusters is that it does go further than that to really hammer home individual voices for all 8 Ghostbusters. All 4 of the Real Ghostbusters and all 4 of the IDW Ghostbusters. See, that's the weird thing about distinguishing between the teams, is that technically the IDW version are the real Ghostbusters, because that's what the movie version, that's technically the movie version, but the animated series is called The Real Ghostbusters, so that's what you want to call it. But it's confusing. I'll struggle with it throughout this entire review, so watch me struggle, kids. Watch me in torment. But the different voices for all of them are spot on, and it was no problem reading the Real Ghostbusters dialogue in particular to just slot those voices in from the cartoon in my head, and it just worked out perfectly. Like, this book really feels like, in the sections that take place in the Real Ghostbusters universe, especially towards the beginning, it really just feels like you're watching another episode of the cartoon. And watching as much of it as I have been lately, I'm trying to get through at least the first 2 seasons, which apparently are the best parts of it. It feels like just popping in another episode. So that's really, really great and really fun. And helps when they do meet up with the IDW Ghostbusters, because then it feels like you're really combining those 2 different tones of watching an episode of that cartoon and maybe putting in the original Ghostbusters movie, or even just watching a Ghostbusters thing with the traditional actors. And that's the weird thing about coming into this with the IDW Ghostbusters side of this, because when I read this, and this is important, I actually hadn't read any of the IDW Ghostbusters stuff yet. I just was familiar with Real Ghostbusters and have seen the movies and played the 09 game in terms of what the IDW versions are canonical with. So anything that happened to those Ghostbusters in the comics, haven't read yet. Will at some point, haven't yet. So it was interesting, because I almost came into this with a reversed sort of perspective on it, as I think you're supposed to. You know, I think it wants you to come into it with well, you know the IDW Ghostbusters because you've been reading them, but in case you kids who are reading that series didn't grow up with the Real Ghostbusters, here's what they're about. Not that it reads in such a way where it's it treats its audience where it's if it expects you to not know the Real Ghostbusters. I don't even think that matters, but it plays both ways, I think, where if you're familiar with it, it feels like just another, it feels like a perfect translation of that universe. But if you're not, I don't think there's anything where you're what are these weird different color hair version of the Ghostbusters doing, and why are they so different? I think it works both ways in terms of introducing you to them if you don't know them, and just having this be another adventure with them if you know them already. But the IDW Ghostbusters, I think there is definitely a bit of an assumption that, yeah, but it's even not that much. But I think there is more of an assumption that you are familiar with the IDW Ghostbusters because you've been reading their comics lately. So there's a lot more direct references to events in their comics made than events that the Real Ghostbusters went through in the cartoon. And I thought that would be more of a problem when I started reading and they first started to crop up, because I was worried that too much of it now would be I feel like I don't even know or care about the IDW version of the Ghostbusters. But it doesn't happen too often, and I feel like it more comes off well, this is a more seasoned version of the movie Ghostbusters, and they've been through a lot of stuff since they started in '84. So this is just stuff that's happened to them, and the Real Ghostbusters aren't familiar with what those versions have done anyway. So I, at the very least, was able to kind of go, well, I'm just as lost in terms of the details on that as they are, so I guess it kind of works. There's one reference that is a bit important later on, where they bring up that they got stuck in limbo at one point, the IDW Ghostbusters, and I don't remember that happening in any Ghostbusters thing that I'd ever seen in the official original timeline. So I figured that that's something that must have happened in the comics that I haven't read. I don't think that happened in the first volume that I read. I could be mistaken. I read that like super late at night and I was really tired, so I don't exactly remember the details of it solidly. But I don't think they got stuck in limbo, so I think that must have happened in something I haven't read. But the real Ghostbusters respond to that, and they're like, wow, that fucking sucks. Let's make sure that doesn't happen to us. And later on, it does happen to them. So spoilers, by the way. I guess I should have said that at the beginning. But that's not a huge spoiler. And this is a hard thing. This sort of thing is a hard thing to spoil. Like, if just me telling you that this is a crossover between the real Ghostbusters and the official original timeline version of the Ghostbusters, and that doesn't make you want to read it already, then, you know, there's probably not much I can say to sway you, or there's not much I would need to say to sway you otherwise. So I don't really think spoilers is such a big deal with this, and also this is just the thing, this is a hard thing to spoil because this is a novelty, man. This is just a novelty item. This is a novelty story. There's no big sort of, like, world-shattering point being made here. This is just a novelty. And it presents itself as that from the get-go, with the trade anyway, where the cover is meant to be a VHS, like, a VHS tape cover, which I think is freaking awesome. Sorry, I'm trying to show it off on the camera here and trying to get a right angle on it. I can't really see. But this is supposed to be like a VHS, like, cover. I think that's awesome. And it plays it up like it's a video special where two versions of the Ghostbusters meet, and I think that that's awesome. And just cover design-wise, it's just super cool to see a comic book that looks like a VHS cover. That's fucking awesome. But back to the story here. So, like I said, it's played up as a novelty, so there's a lot of breathing room left in there for the two teams of Ghostbusters to kind of mess around with each other and with each other's universes. So, for instance, we open on the real Ghostbusters, which, again, I think that this is written in such a way, and I think that this is another great thing about it. It's written in such a way where you can come into this from either perspective of, if you're more familiar with the real Ghostbusters and not so much with the IDW versions, you can come into this and get what's going on because it opens in the real Ghostbusters universe, and it's told from their point of view of moving from their universe to the official original timeline universe, or the IDW version of the universe. And then it goes from there, and we're introduced to the IDW world as they are. But back to what I was trying to get to, which is, this is just really fun to see the two Ghostbusters teams hanging out. That's why you're fucking reading this. You're not reading it for a great, you know, immaculate story. You're reading it to see these 8 guys, like, talk to each other and be funny as they bounce off each other. And you do certainly want, like, a good conflict for them to have to stand up against together, because otherwise, you know, kind of what is the point then? And that's certainly you'd be seeing the best of those interactions put into that situation. And I think the conflict that they're put into is fine, but the focus and what really works about this thing is when the 8 Ghostbusters are just chilling in the firehouse, just hanging out, trying to figure out what's going on, trying to figure out what the differences are between the 8 of them, and how to get the real Ghostbusters home, and also trying to help them with what they learn to be a pretty big problem that they have. So that element of it is definitely the best thing. All the voices for all the Ghostbusters are spot on, particularly Venkman. Venkman is my favorite Ghostbuster. I'm a huge Bill Murray fan. And I also am a big fan of the real Ghostbusters version of Peter Venkman, who was actually voiced by the guy who played Garfield. And I'm sure if you follow James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd, you've heard this piece of trivia thrown out there before. But the guy who played Garfield originally played Peter Venkman in the real Ghostbusters, and then Bill Murray, who played Peter Venkman in the original Ghostbusters, played Garfield in the live-action movies. So I really like what that Garfield actor did with the character of Peter Venkman, though. I think it's spot on and just as fun as the Bill Murray version, and he did a really good animated version of that character. So those two stuck out to me the most. Now, that being said, the IDW version of Venkman, I don't think is just straight up the Bill Murray movie version, or at least it just slotting in Bill Murray's voice when he talked wasn't as just kind of smooth and seamless as slotting in the Real Ghostbusters actor voice for the Real Ghostbusters version of Venkman. A couple of times it felt like they both could have said that, and it both would have been the same. Like, I could use the Real Ghostbusters voice actor for the IDW Venkman for whenever he was talking, and it would have sounded the same. But I do think that there were one or two moments where they did kind of make the Bill Murray version line up more with Bill Murray's performance, particularly in terms of the Ghostbusters in the movie have a much more kind of subdued set of personalities. Like, again, the Real Ghostbusters are a cartoon, so their personalities are a bit more exaggerated, and their actions and their mannerisms are a little more exaggerated. And what I liked about this was that the subtleties of the movie versions are brought out, and, you know, Venkman's a bit more kind of laid back and subdued in the movies, and a bit more kind of like not like he requires a bit more motivation to intervene in the weird out there goings on of the Ghostbusters. So he hangs back a little more than the Real Ghostbusters version of Venkman might, where he comes in there with a lot more quips and one-liners and everything, and insults to different members of the Ghostbusters. So there are different subtle distinctions made between the two Venkmans, but I must say that most of the really well done, clear distinctions between the different Ghostbusters was done with the rest of them. Just again, Venkman felt like the one that was the biggest struggle, because I think that ultimately he was kind of the one who was best adapted. Like, the Real Ghostbusters version of Peter is a really good adaptation of Bill Murray's performance. So I feel like making those two look different was harder. But again, it is done in certain instances, and I think that it was done enough where you can give it credit for that. But again, I think that it's done better with the rest of them. So Ray, I think, is actually done maybe the best, although Egon's done really well as well. But I think Egon, a bit like Peter, is very close to both versions. But with Ray, I think they make the best distinction between the two of them, because Real Ghostbusters Ray, his exaggeration of the personality that Dan Aykroyd played in the original movie is a lot more evident in his characterization, where he's a lot like Ray has always been described as like the heart of the Ghostbusters, like the kind of childlike, you know, sort of awe-inspired, you know, big-eyed kind of enthusiastic ball of energy for the team to kind of to get their motivation to continue to deal with this crap, you know, from. And I think that the animated version is a lot more childlike and a lot more kind of, you know, kind of surging with energy, and he's all over the place, and he's saying 10 different things, and his childlike enthusiasm comes out a lot more in the animated version. And the Dan Aykroyd live-action version also has that, but I think that he's, again, a lot more subdued because it's from a live-action universe, and because Dan Aykroyd's performance was interesting because Ray did have those childlike moments of enthusiasm, but he also acted like a normal guy. And not that the cartoon version is weird, I mean, maybe a little bit, but he also acted like more of an adult than the cartoon version did. Like, he smoked and drank beer just like a normal adult would. And I think that makes the distinction between them interesting, because the live-action version of Ray just seems a little bit more kind of grizzled, a bit more kind of like a little more grown up. And then that was interesting to see them bounce off of each other. And it was interesting to see the live-action version of Ray, or the IDW version. I keep saying live-action when they're drawn just as cartoonily as the Real Ghostbusters are. But the IDW version of Ray had a couple moments where he was like, I like this guy, because he's not afraid to just be a big kid. And I feel like maybe the IDW version of Ray holds back a little bit just because he's, you know, a real person and surrounded by more subdued personalities. Egon, on the other hand, Egon is written perfectly, both versions. Again, distinction is done awesomely. But they're just more similar inherently because they're both cold, hard intellectuals. Real Ghostbusters Egon makes more jokes And again, exaggerated personality. And Real Ghostbusters Egon, I think, is a bit quicker to have a comment or a more sarcastic comment on whatever's going on. And his way of explaining all the technobabble is maybe a little more kind of down to earth, and he's always like quicker to throw it in there as well, I feel. And then it's up to IDW original timeline Egon to come in there and be like, well, here's what's actually going on, and he's a bit more quiet, the IDW version. He's a little more a little more held back, just like I've been saying. The Real Ghostbusters version of Egon just spouts paragraphs upon paragraphs of exposition and shit. And I feel like the IDW version says what he needs to say, and then he's done. He doesn't fuck around, the IDW version of Egon, whereas I feel the Real Ghostbusters version fucks around a little bit. Winston, I also thought was really cool, because the Real Ghostbusters version of Winston was almost the one I felt like the voice matched the best, and then comparing him to reading IDW Winston, which I just slotted in Ernie Hudson, worked really well. Because the Real Ghostbusters version of Winston has this thing where where at the beginning, when they first meet up, the two different versions of them, he kind of is like, I don't really like this whole multiple dimension thing. The other version of Winston, the IDW version, seems to be almost a bit like, well, hey, what, you don't like the other version of yourself that you bumped into? He seems very against the whole multiple dimensions, and what he says in what Real Ghostbusters Winston says in the comics is, I don't like the universe to be multiple choice, and I really like that line, and I really like that distinction. But IDW Winston just follows that up with, well, we'll try to get you home as quickly as possible. Although he also does seem to be a little bit more kind of against it. But Winston is never a fan of the really crazy supernatural incidents that go on. He just wants to deal with them and do as good of a job as he can, because he's a practical working man. And also a former Marine, and that comes into it in this as well. And that's not something I knew about Winston, and I don't think that was ever made explicit in the movies until they made the IDW comics, but they play it up in this, that both versions of Winston spent time in the Army, which I guess is fine. I think it would have maybe been more interesting to leave the Marine background to the IDW Winston and just have the Real Ghostbusters version just be a blue-collar working-class guy, because the Marine thing was never brought into the cartoon as far as I'm aware, but it's fine. It leads to some fun kind of Marine banter between the two of them. They overall, I think the voices for all the characters are the best thing about this, and done really, really well. Venkman's the one where it's the weirdest at points, because I feel like he's struggling a bit, the writer, who is Eric Burnham, I believe. Yeah, Eric Burnham, who writes all the IDW Ghostbusters stuff. And it seems like he's struggling the most there, because, again, both versions are so close together, and both are really good adaptations, so it's hard to distinguish, I think, but it does as good of a job as it can. The other differences in the universe are really the thing you read this for, and again, are really, really cool and interesting. Slimer is awesome in this. Not in this a lot, which I was thankful for, because you can do too much of Slimer in both the Real Ghostbusters and in other Ghostbusters stuff. He's not the original timeline IDW version isn't in any of it as much as Slimer is in the Real Ghostbusters, just because they're very different characters. And that's another thing I loved, is that they kept movie Slimer the same for the IDW comics, and they kept the Real Ghostbusters version the same, obviously, who was changed for the show to be a bit more of a pet for the Ghostbusters, as opposed to this disgusting, self-indulgent monster, who they busted in the first movie, and who Peter hates him in both versions, but Peter hates him, and the other Ghostbusters obviously don't put up with his shit in the IDW timeline, whereas the Real Ghostbusters, do put up with Slimer shit, and they keep him as a pet. I wish that both versions of Slimer had gotten to meet, because I wonder if the Real Ghostbusters version would have been scared of Slimer, like the IDW timeline version, because that would have been funny, and they don't do that, unfortunately. But That would have been fun. Sadly, we don't get that. There's this really great moment where the real Ghostbusters first get to the other version of the firehouse, the IDW version, and they find Slimer in a containment unit, and they're like, "What happened? How'd you get in there, buddy?" And I think they do let him out, and they do definitely let him out, and then they have to bust him and put him in a trap and put him back in there. That was really great. I love that moment. And that's, of course, when the IDW Ghostbusters burst in. They're like, "What the fuck's going on, man?" And that moment's really great because they all line up and just stare at each other. But there's lots of great moments like that where the distinctions in the universe really play up the comedy a lot and lead to some really funny situations. When IDW Ray, actually has to travel interdimensionally to the real Ghostbusters universe to get readings on their firehouse, because apparently their entire universe is just seeping with PKE energy, with psycho ecto energy or whatever. There's lots of ghost activity going on, lots of paranormal activity going on in the real Ghostbusters universe, which led to them being transported to the IDW version. I'll get to the villain plot in a minute, because that's like the biggest kind of thing about this, so I'll save that for the end. But Ray goes to the real Ghostbusters firehouse, and he sees the real Ghostbusters version of Janine and Slimer like trying to figure out what's going on themselves. And there's this great moment where Slimer sees the IDW Ray snooping around their firehouse, and he's trying not to interact with them for some reason. Like, he doesn't introduce himself to either Janine or Slimer. He just peeks in, has this big like metal suit on because he doesn't want to get exposed to the PKE energy. And then he fucks off, but before he does, Slimer gets scared, runs into him, and he gets all covered in slime. That was great. Although it might have been funnier if it was IDW Venkman who got put into that situation, because, he's the one who has the thing with Slimer where he keeps getting slimed by him. So it would have been fun if IDW Venkman had gotten to do that. But, what can you do? So I think the last thing I'll cover with this is the villain plot, because this has already gone on for a little longer than I anticipated. But the villain plot in this, which gets the real Ghostbusters to the IDW universe, and is the ultimate conflict that both teams have to come together to resolve, is a big, blonde, muscly dude. He's this guy on the cover here. There you go, that guy. He looks like maybe not what you'd expect a Ghostbusters villain to look like, kind of like a Greek god type. I don't remember his name. Let's see what it is here. Just quick. I think it might be Proteus, maybe. I believe it is Proteus. What his plot is ultimately is he wants to capture the real Ghostbusters as a prize, as like some sort of just trophy, because he has this thing about being captured, where if he's captured, whoever has captured him, he has to tell them the future. And he's heard about the Ghostbusters, and he doesn't want to be busted by them because he's going to have to tell them the future. And so he's in the real Ghostbusters universe, so he goes to try and capture them, and it doesn't go well. There's some, nice elderly black woman who the real Ghostbusters help out as they're being attacked while she's being attacked by a bunch of ghosts. And she feels indebted to them because they don't charge her for it. And that was a great scene where Venkman tries to charge her for it. And Egon is like, "What the fuck are you doing? Let's go. Come on, there's other shit to deal with." So, because she feels indebted, though, she is a spellcaster, some kind of magician, conveniently. And she tries to cast a protection spell on the Ghostbusters while they're fighting off Proteus. And what the protection spell ends up doing is it interacts with Proteus's energy when he tries to capture them. And instead of sending them to his prison or whatever, it sends them to the IDW Ghostbusters universe. And because of the protection spell that the nice elderly black woman threw in there. And it's a weird contrivance, and again, I think the villain plot is the worst thing about this. And it's very dumb and very convenient that those two things happen to come together to send the real Ghostbusters to the IDW universe. I don't know why Proteus couldn't have just blasted them, and instead of them going to wherever he wanted them to go, they could have just gone to the IDW universe, because we see later that Proteus has a bit of a hard time honing in on traveling to different dimensions because he can't fucking find the real Ghostbusters. So he ends up going to a bunch of different Ghostbusters dimensions, trying to find them, and messes around with a whole bunch of other Ghostbusters teams, which is another really great thing that they do in this. So I don't know why they couldn't have just had Proteus just throw them in there. I don't know why the nice elderly black woman had to be thrown in there. Because she's only relevant at the very beginning and the very end, and then she's turned into a bird throughout the rest of it. So, I don't know, man. I don't know why she had to be in there. I don't know why she had to be a bird, but she was. So, that was another kind of weak element of this. But Proteus himself, he's big and boring. They kind of try to make him a big deal because he's like a primordial god on the level of Gozer, so he can look like whatever he wants. And later on, when he fights the Ghostbusters in Moss, like all 8 of them, he changes form. But whatever, man. He's a big, dumb, blonde guy, and I know nothing of what it's like to be like that, you know? But, you know, he's not that interesting, and he's kind of whiny because he just wants to get the real Ghostbusters because he doesn't want to be captured. He's just big and whiny, and I don't really know what he's on about. And I also don't really know why he's so reluctant to tell the real Ghostbusters their future. Like, when he does finally get captured at the end by both teams, he ends up having to tell all of them their futures, and it's just ghosts that they're gonna bust. I don't know why he didn't want to tell them that. Like, and that is a cool moment, because you get to see, like, some ghosts that the real Ghostbusters got to fight later in their series. Like, you see, there's a ghost that they fought in one episode who was like the god who was the inspiration for Halloween, and he is one of the ghosts that is seen in one of the futures. So that was pretty cool. I enjoyed that, but it's just kind of, it leaves you scratching your head. The stakes just don't feel very high. Like, even when Proteus captures the real Ghostbusters and they get stuck in, it's the thing I mentioned before, where they themselves get stuck in a limbo of sorts, and they end up having to do what the IDW Ghostbusters did to get out, which is blow their way out. Or Janine does, technically, but they had the idea. And I do like that both Ghostbusters teams get their ideas from each other in terms of how to solve the problem. That was cool. But the villain plot in this it's a little weak. It doesn't feel as well thought out or just as interesting, factually, as the Ghostbusters just meeting up and getting to hang out. But it's not bad. It's just not very interesting. It's a little kind of by the numbers, and there's just some head-scratching elements of it that just aren't explained. Like, there's one moment where, and it's kind of cliched, it's a little cool, but it's a little cliched, where Proteus sends out this, like, 3-headed dog monster to try and track down the universe where the real Ghostbusters have, been sent to, so he can capture them. And so we just see this bit where it's kind of cool, actually, at first, because the Ghostbusters get a call, the IDW Ghostbusters do, from Janine, their version of Janine, to go on a case at the Bronx Zoo, because there's some kind of paranormal disturbance going on. And they have the real Ghostbusters in their firehouse stuck there. And they're all like, well, I guess we could use the extra hands, so why don't you come along? And that's a really great moment. And then we cut to the next issue. We cut to the Bronx Zoo, and we see the Ecto-1 pull up. We see ghosts in the Bronx Zoo, but it's not the real ghost. We see the dog at the Bronx Zoo, but it's not the real Ghostbusters and the IDW Ghostbusters coming in to solve the problem. It's actually the Extreme Ghostbusters from the Extreme Ghostbusters cartoon. And they come in to fight off... Oh, no, I actually think they come in to fight off Proteus. My bad. The dog is later. Proteus actually shows up in the Extreme Ghostbusters universe to try and find the real Ghostbusters. And technically they are there. Or a future version of them, so that's a little weird. Because the Extreme Ghostbusters is a sequel to the real Ghostbusters, so they are technically in the same universe. that's a cool moment to like, it's a nice kind of fake out where you go to the Bronx Zoo and you think the story's going to continue, but actually it's this whole other side thing that happens, this funny side thing. So I really enjoyed that. But back to what I was kind of complaining about. There was this scene where Proteus sends out this three-headed hellhound who kind of looks like the terror dogs from the first movie. Here, that's them right there. And they kind of look like the terror dogs, and I guess that's an intentional nod, but it doesn't get brought up by anybody, so it just kind of comes off as weird. But there's this scene where it's kind of going through the different dimensions looking for the real Ghostbusters, and you see that represented as a bunch of dimensions, like represented as like broken glass and everything. You just see like different snapshots of what each different Ghostbusters universe looks like, and it reminded me a lot of the scene from Turtles Forever, that TMNT special they did a few years back that celebrated the whatever anniversary of Ninja Turtles that was. And that was a crossover between the 2003 Ninja Turtles and the 80s Ninja Turtles, and that had a similar scene where it was just like a tapestry of different Ninja Turtles universes that existed in the same multiverse, and that also happens in this, and that's kind of a cliche, just to even see that kind of shot of it, and I don't really think you needed that, because you could also tell that a bunch of them were made up, and they looked the same. They were just kind of done in slightly different art styles, but they kind of looked the same character model-wise. Like, they were all just kind of variations on the movie Ghostbusters characters and the real Ghostbusters caricatures. So you had, like, different styles of both. Like, there was one that was as photorealistic as possible with the movie Ghostbusters, so they looked like the movie actors a bit more than the IDW versions do even. And then there was like this like more simplified younger version of the real Ghostbusters. But then there was some interesting stuff. There was this one Ghostbusters team who seems to be set more in the future, who they have like these blue jumpsuits on, and there's actually a scene where the dog, the Hellhound, goes to their universe and fights them briefly. And I don't know what universe that is. I've never seen it before. All male, they're all kinds of different ethnicities and everything. I have no idea what their deal is, but that was kind of a fun scene. Because they're more kind of paramilitaristic about being Ghostbusters and a bit more kind of serious about it. Like, when the ghost gets away, they're a bit like, damn, we've lost the capture. So that was kind of cool to see that distinction. But that was just a bit cliched, and I didn't really think you had to go too far into showing all these different Ghostbusters universes. I mean, there aren't enough of them. I mean, now you could have the female Ghostbusters universe pop up in there, if you'd want that. But you know, there's different things you could do now, but when this was made, you didn't really have options, so they had to make up a whole bunch of them, and they weren't really all that interesting. There was another one where there were giant robots that were in there, so I guess they were supposed to be like a tokusatsu version of the Ghostbusters, but I don't know, man. I didn't think you needed that scene. So, kind of just to wrap up on this, because we've been going for a while now, I really enjoyed this. I wish the villain plot made a little more sense and was a little less by the numbers, and was a little less boring, with a less boring villain. But at the end of the day, this is really, really fun, and I think that if you're a Ghostbusters fan, you should definitely give this a go, because it's a great, great time. It's hilarious. The jokes are great. There's so many references and homages and different things spun on their head. If you're a fan of the Ghostbusters universe, any and all of them, I would definitely say give this a go, because it's a nice tribute to all of them, and it's just really fun to get to see a really well-written, greatly adapted version of the real Ghostbusters crossover with the IDW Ghostbusters, who I'm also really learning to love, and that style of writing with them. I just read the first volume of the IDW Ghostbusters series. It's great, but it's very different than this is, so I'll cover that on its own at some point maybe, but this is a lot more of just kind of a novelty, fun romp, whereas that's a bit more kind of hardcore world building and story happens in that. But this, on the other hand, just fun. So give it a go, kids. It's lots of fun. Get real, as they say. So I think that's going to do it for my review of Get Real Ghostbusters. You can find this at your local comic shop, presumably. So, as I said earlier, though, I mentioned that Ghostbusters 2 was going to come up at some point in this video, and I'm going to bring it up now because my new rating system, I haven't put this in any videos yet, you'll be familiar with this if you follow me on Facebook. My new rating system for anything, movies, comics, video games, whatever, is based on whether or not they are simply better or worse than Ghostbusters 2. I just find that to be the simplest way to break down whether or not something is good or bad. I know Ghostbusters 2. I know how I feel about Ghostbusters 2. So, that's just my rating system. And I think that if you know Ghostbusters 2, it'll apply for you as well. And I would definitely say that Get Real Ghostbusters is better than Ghostbusters 2. So I hope that helped you out in terms of deciding whether or not you should pick this one up, kids. Again, I definitely think you should. I think it's great fun. So, I'm going to be back with some more actual Ghostbusters-themed videos coming up soon. We did a sort of through the shot glass on an episode of The Real Ghostbusters right before G-Fest, and I may or may not be able to put that up because it was kind of weirdly recorded and there was maybe too many people on the commentary, and I don't know what the deal with that one is going to be. I don't know if I'm going to be able to release it in any kind of intelligible manner, so we'll see what happens, kids. I'm also planning on doing a review of the first volume of the IDW Ghostbusters, so look out for that soon. And all kinds of other videos, kids. I'm also planning on getting up the actual first episode of the newly restructured Through the Shot Glass in the next week or so. I've got that one almost in the bag, so I'll get that up soon. And then I've also got a King Kong 76 Through the Shot Glass that I did with Kyle, and Cal, as he's more commonly known, and my friend Jake. That we'd recorded actually like 2 weeks before G-Fest. So I have to get that up too. So I've got videos that are in the can that I have to edit and get up there. I've also got another Godzilla video that I recorded months back that I just never edited. That's a bit more of a strenuous editing job that I do have to finally get up. So look out for that soon as well. I'll finally get that done soon too. But look out for all of that and more, and maybe less, coming from me, Zazubaar, in the future. So until next time, kids, I ain't afraid of no ghosts, but except maybe a little bit. So don't count on me to bust them for you. So see you later, everyone.